One of the things I always loved doing, and even still today, is to reimagine how games could have been different. For those who have watched this channel for a while now, this is probably obvious. I love tweaking stories and throwing wrenches into plots to figure out how the story would be completely different. From swapping Mario and Link in their Nintendo 64 games, to hypothesizing what would happen if Link never left Kokiri Forest in Ocarina of Time, or if Bongo Bongo took refuge in the Deku Tree. I've tackled concepts like this across a lot of different games, and all in good fun of course. My mind simply runs wild with the concept because I like hearing what other people think about it. Everything I do is obviously based around tweaks that I introduce myself, but sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes new information comes about that completely changes your perception of what could have been. Like when Pokemon Gold and Silver's beta Pokemon were finally leaked. Stuff like this changes everything, because it makes you take a step back and think about what could have been versus what actually made it. And if for some reason one of these earlier concepts were accepted, well, it's crazy to think about how much your world would have changed. Not just in reference to the individual story you loved at the time, but how from that point forward it would have rippled through the future games to come. And today we have one of those stories. The story about how Wario almost replaced King K. Rool in the Donkey Kong series. So in order to tell this story properly and basically explain how this whole Wario situation came to be, first I need to set the stage from my perspective. Because without one person in particular, or rather two I suppose, most of us would honestly still be in the dark about this. So in 2018, after my book came out about becoming a YouTuber, I did a lot of traveling and I went to a lot of conventions. This was both exhausting and exciting. And during two of these conventions in particular, I happened to be adjacent to a comic artist. Typically, I end up getting a booth space at conventions to both sign books and to say hello to people. And this is where I met someone named Topher. Now Topher is a Wario fanatic. He's super passionate about this grumpy yellow guy and actually has a very impressive Wario collection. We ended up shooting the breeze for a while, hung out, and then went our separate ways. Fast forward a year later though, and Topher tweets out something rather interesting. Something that looks like an old book with the heading Donkey Kong vs Super Wario. The tweet reads as follows, quote, "Can you guys try and help me find more info on this cancelled rare pitch? This is apparently the cover of a pitch book that was shown to Nintendo in the mid-90s. Gotta be someone who can help us get a peek inside." End quote. Up until this point, no one really knew a whole lot about this book. And with a cover like that, it was just begging to be opened. But this tweet is actually what set off a really cool chain reaction, which led to the book finally being revealed. Later that day, after the tweet went out, Greg Mayles responded over Twitter. Now, if you're not familiar with that name in particular, Greg is a video game designer who has worked at Rare for quite a while. Him and a few other awesome individuals are what brought about Donkey Kong Country, Battletoads, and eventually Banjo-Kazooie. So of all the people who could respond to give an answer, he was just about the perfect one. In his tweet, he said the following, quote, "It's an early pitch we made to Nintendo that eventually became Donkey Kong Country. They wanted all new bad guys, so we used our reptile Kremlings instead. I still have the book somewhere, but I'm sure I tweeted some images from inside it a few years ago." End quote. It turns out Greg hadn't actually tweeted out images before, so that's when he got the book and did so. And what was inside was truly quite a departure from what we know and love today. Super Wario, holding a magical gun, plans to stop Mario once and for all. Greg ended up tweeting out 3 images associated with the book besides the cover. The first shows Mario tinkering with a machine that we then learn is actually a time machine from the text below the image. In it, Mario says, quote, "Well, I guess that wraps things up for a day. I'll test my time machine tomorrow." End quote. In the next image, we see Wario holding the futuristic beam gun, as the subscript says at the top of the page. Wario states, quote, "Nothing can stop me now. With this gun, I'll rule Nintendo Land." End quote. In the back of this image, there is a silhouette of a bird, which is assumed to be the bird from the next image. In this image, the pair informs Donkey Kong about what Wario did, which is apparently turned Mario to stone. Donkey Kong states that they don't have a moment to lose, and I imagine this is what kickstarts the adventure. It turns out, all of this was actually an initial pitch that would later become Donkey Kong Country. Greg tweeted these images out with the following, quote, "Topher wanted more info on a disused concept we did for Donkey Kong Country, so here it is. Mario invents a time machine. Wario uses it to acquire a fancy gun that he turns Mario to stone with. A parrot sees it all and flaps off to get DK's help." End quote. Now, flipping back through these images, there's a couple interesting things to note. For one, Wario holding his beam weapon is on page 10, meaning there's obviously a lot of pages we aren't seeing out of this pitch deck. And two, Mario is tinkering with a time machine, which makes sense given that Mario's Time Machine, an educational game, came out in the early 90s, especially since this pitch deck was for Donkey Kong Country. Now mind you, pitch decks like this and pre-concepts happen for every game out there. Things change a ton before the final concept is approved. But when that concept is at the beginning of the cycle for a long series of games, a tweak to that concept makes quite a ripple as time goes on. So what if Wario was the villain in Donkey Kong Country? What would that mean for the series in general? Well, first and foremost, the inciting incident for the game and the recurring pain point for the series wouldn't have existed. The theft of DK's banana hoard was no longer what called our monkey duo to action. Instead, it was Mario being turned to stone. Given that the last encounter Mario had with DK wasn't exactly on the greatest of terms, it seems interesting that in this scenario, Donkey Kong instantly jumps to action to save the iconic plumber. It would also make sense that in this pitch for Donkey Kong Country, a lot of the Mario enemies may have been utilized alongside Wario. We can sort of assume this from what Greg said about Nintendo wanting new bad guys. Donkey Kong's colorful cast may have been still present in some regards, but pre-existing baddies were more than likely sprinkled in with the mix. Probably the most notable change of all is that King K. Rool may have never existed if this went through, with Wario taking the reins of being the biggest and baddest foe around. I imagine the final fight would have been Donkey Kong taking him on to free Mario from his stone prison. Kinda weird to think that if somehow this was accepted, not only would all the future games change, but he'd be absent from Super Smash Bros. Ultimate as well. In an interview from almost a decade ago via NowGamer.com, it appears Donkey Kong Country sort of came about from a visit by Nintendo. Apparently, Nintendo had approached Rare, basically asking them to create a game with better graphics than Aladdin. For those unfamiliar, Aladdin from Sega Genesis is often praised for the amazing animation it had. The Super Nintendo version is often said to look more clunky visually, but the gameplay is said to be a bit better. Generally though, Aladdin on Sega Genesis was a beautiful game and was sort of a visual benchmark. At the time, it appears Rare was experimenting with an early way of utilizing 3D to speed up the animation process when it came to making 2D sprites. This caught Nintendo's eye and is why Nintendo paid them a visit. Little did they know they'd straight up ask them to make the next Donkey Kong game though. Later on in the article, Greg states that he turned to Super Mario Bros. 3 for inspiration in terms of developing the flow of the game. Perhaps at this point, prior to settling on the Donkey Kong vs. King K. Rool approach, this inspiration also influenced the potential plans for the original Wario concept as well. In some ways, Donkey Kong Country could have been a more fluid version of a pseudo Mario game, where momentum and player skill would allow a player to fly through a level with grace. Diddy Kong and the other characters didn't really exist yet either, and it wasn't until a later pitch when their characters began to take form. Mind you, Cranky Kong was called Grandpa Kong, and Diddy was actually Donkey Kong Jr. in the other pitch, but from that point forward, the characters began to form into what they are today. If the Wario concept moved forward, these characters may have never existed. It's said that Diddy's inclusion was sort of as a way to mimic Super Mario Bros. 2-hit system, with Big Mario and Little Mario. But if the Mario universe was still intact within the game, with both Wario and Mario's inclusion in the plot, would Diddy Kong have ever truly been a thing? Perhaps another mechanic would have been utilized, allowing Donkey Kong to take 2 hits of damage, without the use of a health bar. But then we have the concept of Wario too. This Super Wario idea was pitched roughly around 1992. Or so it seems anyways, which meant Wario himself was still in his infancy. Far from the garlic-chomping anti-hero he would become in the Wario Land series, and farther still from the miserly microgaming miscreant in the WarioWare series. This game, had it been further developed, would have likely established Wario in a slightly different direction, perhaps cementing him in a more villainous role, changing not just the history of Donkey Kong Country, but of the Wario series as well. The idea of Wario as a gun-toting, cape-wearing miscreant would not go unused though. Future Wario installments would feature Wario donning a series of similar costumes and weaponry. Cosmic Wario and Wario Man of the Wario Land and WarioWare series respectively are notable for being similar. But the Wario and Mario inclusion goes even deeper, since it ties everything together location-wise in an interesting way too. It's clear in the pitch itself that the DK Isles and the Mushroom Kingdom as a whole were not considered for the setting. Wario uses the collective term Nintendo Land to refer to the game's setting. This could have drastically shifted the layout and structure of the Nintendo universe had it seen fruition, as both DK Island, the Chromospheres, and the Greater Mushroom Kingdom soon played more active and recurring roles in the Mario universe and sub-universes. A change like this, even not in a true traditional Mario game as we know today, would have certainly had a ripple effect of some kind. Donkey Kong related enemies could have found their way into future installments of Mario titles. Similar to how when Doki Doki Panic was reskinned as Super Mario Bros. 2, the bombs, Shy Guys, and a whole lot of other enemies were sort of absorbed into the Mario universe despite them not actually being from a Mario game. We can certainly see the effect that had on things. I made a video on that a while ago covering the concept, and it changed a lot as well. It truly makes you wonder how much would be different today if instead of going back to the drawing board, things were simply accepted and given the okay for production. Super Wario would have changed everything across the board, if you think about it. But now that I've shared that with all of you, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this pitch. So please share them in the comments below. And of course, a huge shout out to Topher for making me ask in the first place. Without that tweet, it could have been years until we finally knew what was inside the pitch book. Topher contributed a lot of his thoughts for this video when we were writing it, so it is greatly appreciated. Topher is an animator and illustrator by trade and is part of a YouTube channel called Nobody Special. He also has his own comic series called On Patrol, Dusk Bay Chronicles, which I highly recommend checking out if you have the chance. It's about two new recruits in a police department who have to uncover the truth behind the world's first supervillain. You can find a link to both his YouTube channel and the comic in the description below. Oh, and one last thing. We might be able to see the remainder of this pitch book pretty shortly. I reached out to Greg about it back in September when it was first revealed, and he said he's going to try to take some photos and upload the rest online. So fingers crossed that we'll get to take a peek at those soon. If it comes out, I'll post a link as a pinned comment. And with that, thanks for watching guys and gals, and until my next video, cheers.